began on a night much like any other. The sun had slipped beneath the horizon, casting the world into the embrace of twilight as city lights flickered to life, cutting through the dark with familiar patterns of neon and incandescent glow. For a moment, the planet seemed to collectively sigh, easing into the comfort of its routine. But then, on that ordinary night, something extraordinary punctured the fabric of reality. A star unlike any other emerged in the night sky. It moved with an unsettling grace, gliding across the firmament as if it had always been there, hiding just beyond the veil of perception. Amateur astronomers were the first to notice, their excited chatter buzzing across forums and live streams. The object was massive, they said, though its trajectory seemed impossible, hovering, watching, waiting. Within hours, the object became visible to the naked eye, blotting out constellations that had existed for millennia. Panic came in pulses. First, whispers in bars and cafes, then shouts in crowded streets. The news anchors wore masks of strained professionalism as they repeated the same line, their voices trembling beneath a thin veneer of control. A foreign object has entered our orbit. No immediate threat has been identified. Yet, behind them, the screens flashed live feeds of the sky, where the object loomed like a colossal shard of obsidian, dark and cold and alive with a subtle, rhythmic pulse. The first night after its arrival, the world waited with bated breath. Parents held their children close, whispers of prayers drifting through quiet houses. Soldiers gripped their rifles, eyes darting skyward as if anticipating the moment when the stars themselves would rain fire. But nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than an attack. It wrapped around the globe like a suffocating blanket. Then on the fourth day, the silence was broken. It was not with a flash of light or the roar of cannons, but with a whisper that curled into the mind, bypassing ears and logic. The voice was soft, rich, and resonated in the depths of the skull. It spoke in a language unknown but understood, with an intimacy that felt invasive. "We are the Uvarii. We come in peace. Your potential is vast, and we wish to help." It was at once reassuring and unsettling. People reported feeling a warmth trickle down their spines, a brief euphoria that fizzled out into a dull headache. The Uvarii, no longer just a name but a presence, promised wonders. And true to their word, within days, shimmering structures appeared at the edges of major cities. Sleek, silver obelisks that stood taller than the tallest skyscrapers, each one vibrating with a soft, continuous hum. They gave off an unnatural light that bathed entire blocks in an otherworldly glow, tinting skin and stone alike in hues of silver and blue. The Uvarii appeared next. They came from the obelisks, emerging not through doors but materializing as if stepping through a liquid membrane. They were unlike any creature humanity had ever encountered, tall, impossibly slender, with limbs that moved in deliberate, fluid motions. Their skin shimmered, catching light as if it were woven from liquid mercury. Most striking were their eyes, deep black orbs that seemed to drink in everything, reflecting back a perfect, unsettling void. Their presence was intoxicating. Wherever they went, a strange stillness followed. They spoke in voices that resonated in the chest, not through air, but directly through some ancient, primal part of the brain. They offered technology beyond comprehension, machines that purified water in minutes, devices that eradicated diseases with a pulse of light, and seeds that grew into towering crops overnight. Humanity had never seen such wonders, and for a time awe overshadowed fear. but the cracks began to show. The changes came in small, almost imperceptible ways. A farmer from Kansas named Jacob Klein was the first to sound the alarm. He had planted the Uvarii seeds, marveling at the way they sprouted and bore fruit in the span of hours. Yet one night, as he stood in his fields, bathed in the eerie glow of the nearest obelisk, he heard them whisper. Not in words, but in a collective murmur that rippled through the crops. He swore they were speaking to him, speaking about him, their voices hollow and hungry. Jacob tried to warn his neighbors, but they dismissed him, saying the heat had gotten to him. 2 days later, Jacob's fields were found empty, the soil turned over as if an immense force had churned it like water. There was no sign of Jacob, only the echo of his warnings that now seemed to vibrate in the very air. The Uvarii remained silent on such matters, their expressions unreadable. Their gifts continued to flow, and leaders of the world scrambled to show gratitude, fearful of offending the visitors whose power they could not fathom. Yet beneath the surface, the whispers grew. People began to speak of dreams they could not remember, but woke from shivering. Scientists who analyzed the Uvari's devices found their equations twisting into impossibilities, staring too long into the data only to blink away tears of blood and forget what they had been trying to prove. Then came the first recorded disappearance. Lena Kirsch, a bright biologist whose findings had started to paint a more sinister picture of the Uvari's technology. Her colleagues claimed she had stumbled upon something that defied nature, something that throbbed beneath the surface like a heartbeat. The night she was taken, security cameras captured a tall, silvery figure gliding through her lab, and then darkness. The footage ended, and so did Lena's existence in the known world. The world was trapped in the paradox of awe and fear. The Uvari's voice still whispered its promises, still dripped with a veneer of salvation. But as days turned to weeks, the air thickened with something unspeakable, a quiet understanding shared among humans who dared look into the black eyes of the visitors and see nothing looking back. It was not peace they offered, it was something far worse. A question that had no answer, and a silence that promised nothing but despair. In the weeks following the Uvari's grand entry and their bestowal of unfathomable technology, humanity experienced a golden dawn that seemed too perfect to last. The initial months were filled with marvels. Fields once barren now thrived under the Uvari's cultivation methods, spreading an iridescent glow at night that the scientists likened to bioluminescence. Hospitals emptied as incurable diseases were erased by a whisper of the Uvari's light. Cities thrummed with renewed life, their energy grids bolstered by the visitors' miraculous reactors that spun perpetual power from the very essence of the air. For a brief, glittering moment, humanity's greatest struggles seemed resolved, but amidst this golden age, shadows began to stretch, unseen beneath the brilliance. There was an unnatural order to the gifts, as if each came with an invisible thread that tugged at the core of human will. It was Lena Kirsch's disappearance that began to haunt the scientific community. Her work had been pioneering, but also unsettling. She was the first to peer into the living algorithms of the Uvari's technology and return with questions. But after she vanished, an unspoken rule settled. To question was to vanish. Still, curiosity breeds defiance. In the quiet town of Milstead, where the skyline was dominated by one of the smaller, lesser-known Uvarii obelisks, a subtle terror took root. Dr. Hector Alvarez, an elderly botanist and former university professor, received samples of the Uvarii's soil enhancers for study. Hector was meticulous, sifting through particles under his microscope late into the night. On one such evening, his hands trembled as he observed movement, infinitesimal rhythmic pulses like the beating of wings beneath a magnified glass. The particles were alive, and they were aligning, creating patterns that pulsed in sync with the low hum emitted by the obelisk a mile away. The revelation chilled Hector to his core. He jotted down his observations, lines of rushed handwriting that soon smudged with sweat. The patterns suggested something beyond biological assistance. They hinted at control. The soil, enriched with these minute entities, seemed to react, as if testing the air for the taste of human life. He barely had time to voice his concerns before the lights in his lab flickered. The hum grew louder, pressing on his ears like a scream. A shadow fell across his window, elongated and thin. Hector turned only to see two black eyes reflecting back his terror. The next morning, his house stood abandoned, windows ajar as if letting out a final breath. The townspeople murmured about the old botanist who had rambled about the living soil, but soon the whispers quieted. The town's crops continued to grow twice as fast, shimmering in the silver-blue light, and the hunger that had gnawed at them for years became a distant memory. Elsewhere, whispers of discomfort found purchase. A physicist in Berlin who worked closely with the Uvarii power cores began to lose his grasp on reality. Equations he had scribbled 1,000 times now warped before his eyes, twisting into shapes that made no sense, symbols that seemed to mock human logic. He tried to explain it to his colleagues, pointing at the data streams that no longer obeyed the laws of physics, but instead rippled as if alive, breathing in patterns too perfect to be accidental. "They're rewriting the rules," he whispered, voice tight with the exhaustion of sleepless nights. A week later, he was found catatonic, his hands trembling as if they had touched the face of something unknowable. In city centers, the Uvarii moved like ghosts among the humans. They watched with eyes that reflected no light, their smiles a practiced mimicry devoid of warmth. They spoke with voices that reached into the depths of the mind, triggering an involuntary comfort that left the listener's soul cold. Few could meet their gaze for long. Children wept when they walked past, and pets slunk away as if sensing a predator in their midst. Samir Patel, a renowned investigative journalist with a penchant for uncovering hidden truths, decided to follow the thread that others had abandoned out of fear. The stories from Milstead reached him, as did whispers from Berlin and rumors from remote farming communities where crops thrived too brilliantly. He drove across the country to the Nevada desert, where an abandoned Uvarii construct stood as a silent sentinel, overlooked and forgotten after the initial frenzy. The desert winds whispered secrets as they swept across the cracked earth. Under the silvered night sky, Samir crept closer to the obelisk. Its surface shimmered with veins of light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He set up his camera, its red recording light a tiny beacon against the dark. As he touched the structure, a shiver coursed through him, a sensation of being watched from deep within the very metal. Before he could recoil, a section of the obelisk shifted, revealing a cavity lined with something between flesh and machine. Inside, bodies hung suspended in transparent cocoons, their faces frozen in expressions of silent, eternal horror. Their skin glistened with thin, silver threads that seemed to snake under the surface, pulsing in unison with the obelisk. Samir staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He turned to flee, only to find himself face to face with a Uvarii. It moved with an elegance that mocked human fragility, its slender hand outstretched, fingers long and jointless. Its touch was cold, an electric chill that numbed his mind. Samir tried to scream, but his voice dissolved into a deafening silence. The last thing he saw was the Uvari's eyes, absorbing him, reflecting back a darkness that promised no return. The footage from Samir's camera would never be found. His disappearance was marked as an accident, a lost wanderer swallowed by the desert. But in the places he had visited, people began to notice a change. Those who had seen the light of the obelisks for too long, who had eaten the crops and drunk the water, spoke in monotones. Their eyes glazed over at odd moments, and their limbs twitched with small, rhythmic spasms that matched the hum of the silver structures. The Uvarii continued their silent work, weaving their gifts into the fabric of the world, until the gifts themselves became part of humanity's flesh and mind, silent parasites that no one could excise. The whispers grew louder, but so did the fear of what they might reveal, and so the world fell into a quiet compliance, unable to resist the shadow that had crept into their bones. The cityscapes of Earth glittered under a sky that never seemed to darken fully. The obelisks, now fixtures of urban and rural life alike, glowed with a cold, steady pulse, each thrum synchronizing with the unease that crept into the hearts of those who watched them. By now, the disappearances were no longer isolated whispers. They were silent gashes in the social fabric, spreading panic that few dared to voice. To acknowledge the pattern was to invite the attention of the Uvarii, and that was a fate met only with silence and shadow. Among those who refused to stay silent was Leah Tang, a medical researcher in San Francisco. She had been among the first to utilize the Uvari's medical advancements, watching in awe as their cures swept through once crowded hospitals, rendering cancer cells inert and erasing congenital diseases with a flicker of alien light. But the euphoria of progress waned, replaced by gnawing doubt. Patients who had been cured began to return, not with the same ailments, but with hollow eyes and voices that trembled with an unnatural resonance. Leah's investigation led her to Daniel Reese, a once renowned athlete whose body had been ravaged by a rare muscular disease before the Uvarii healed him. He had come to her facility weeks after his miraculous recovery, trembling and incoherent. His muscles twitched beneath his skin as if something skittered just beneath the surface. In his eyes, Leah saw the faint glow of the obelisk's light, a silvery sheen that made him look distant, disconnected. "They're inside," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "Not just the medicine. Us. They're growing in us." Before Leah could question him further, Daniel's body spasmed violently. The silver sheen in his eyes brightened until it consumed his pupils, and he fell silent, motionless as if switched off. Leah's breath caught as his skin began to split, fine silver tendrils erupting from the fissures and weaving through the air before retracting. By the time the paramedics arrived, his body was limp and lifeless, with no sign of the transformation they had witnessed. The report simply read, "Unknown cardiac event." Stories like Daniel's proliferated, but always in hushed tones. Those who noticed too much or spoke too loudly were marked. The first sign was the sound, a deep, resonant hum that thrummed at the edge of hearing, seeping into thoughts and dreams until nothing felt private. Friends and neighbors began to slip away in the night, leaving homes that smelled faintly of ozone and metal. Their departures were explained with nonsensical platitudes about new opportunities or sudden illnesses. Marcus Elson, a former military strategist turned conspiracy theorist, had watched the pattern unfold from his bunker beneath the Appalachian Mountains. His broadcasts, once regarded as paranoid ramblings, became urgent calls to action. He spoke of what he called the Taken, those who had been touched by the Uvarii and returned, changed, hollowed out, or never returned at all. He mapped the disappearances, drawing connecting lines between cities, the glowing obelisks, and the murmurs of resistance that were silenced before they could catch fire. But his warnings fell on ears too afraid to listen. By then, the obelisk's hum had woven itself into the subconscious of the planet, lulling people into compliance. Even those who knew the danger felt it deep in their bones, a weariness that eroded defiance into passive acceptance. Then, in a turn that no one could ignore, New York City became the stage for the first large-scale activation. On a night that seemed no different from any other, the obelisk in Central Park pulsed once, twice, then emitted a flash so brilliant it blinded onlookers. The city held its breath as an eerie silence followed. Then came the screams. From the streets and buildings, thousands emerged with eyes glowing like molten silver. Their movements were jerky at first, as if awakening from deep sleep, but soon synchronized into an unnatural unity. They spoke in unison, voices layered and discordant. "We are becoming." The world watched, paralyzed, as the taken citizens of New York began to transform. Their skin cracked and peeled, revealing fibrous networks of silver tendrils that connected like veins of liquid metal. They weren't human anymore, not entirely. They were conduits, vessels reshaped for a purpose humanity could not comprehend. Leah Tang, now underground with what remained of her research team, pieced together the horror of the transformation. The Uvari's gifts were not gifts at all, but seeds planted deep within human biology, designed to reshape them from the inside out. The water they drank, the food they ate, even the very air that hummed with the Uvari's energy had been part of an elaborate assimilation process. Humanity was not being conquered by force, but harvested and rewritten. "We're being prepared," Leah said, her voice breaking as she stared at her notes, now meaningless under the weight of the revelation. But for what? In the days that followed, more cities fell silent, each one marked by the same sequence: the hum, the light, the transformation. Those who resisted or tried to run were met with the figures that had haunted humanity's streets since the Uvari's arrival. The tall, slender beings moved like specters, their presence suffocating and absolute. They didn't need violence. Their very presence bent the will of any human who stood in their way. The transformed were not mindless drones. They were something worse. They retained memories, echoes of who they had been, but their loyalty lay with the Uvarii, a cosmic instinct that overrode all else. They spoke with voices layered in metallic harmony, repeating phrases that spoke of unity and rebirth, punctuated by the same haunting declaration: "We are becoming." The world had fallen into an unearthly stillness, punctuated only by the whispers of the obelisks and the glint of silver in the eyes of the transformed. Marcus Elson's last broadcast was a frantic plea, eyes wide with fear, his voice cracking as he urged the world to resist, to run, to hide. But by then, it was too late. The Taken were everywhere, and the transformation had begun, seeding its way into the very bones of humanity. As Leah watched the last of Marcus's broadcast, the bunker shuddered with a low hum. The lights flickered, casting her shadow in long, trembling arcs across the walls. From above, through the concrete and steel, she could feel the pull of something vast and ancient, reaching down, ready to claim what had always been intended for it. The world that remained was a husk of what it once was. The hum of the obelisks was now the heartbeat of Earth, a throbbing reminder that the Uvarii had woven themselves into every fiber of human existence. The sky had taken on a strange, shimmering quality, veined with streaks of metallic light that stretched across continents, connecting cities like a vast, pulsating web. Silence reigned, punctuated only by the rhythmic whisper of transformation, the sound of humanity being rewritten at the cellular level. In the hidden bunker beneath the ruins of what had once been Washington, D.C., Marcus Elsin stood before a map littered with red pins and frantic circles. His eyes, sunken and rimmed with exhaustion, scanned the dwindling zones marked as Resistance Strongholds. Beside him, Leah Tang leaned heavily on a metal table, her fingers drumming a chaotic rhythm that betrayed her fraying nerves. The dim light from a single overhead bulb cast their faces in sharp relief, emphasizing the gauntness, the silent resignation in their eyes. "They've taken Paris," Leah whispered, the words barely escaping her cracked lips. "It's happening faster now." Marcus didn't respond. His gaze lingered on the map, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the broadcast he had intercepted the night before. It had been brief, garbled images of a Uvarii speaking, its voice a chorus of tones that resonated deep within his chest. The words were inhuman, but he felt their meaning, felt the chill as it seeped into his bones. The cycle is complete. We are here to harvest the rebirth. Leah reached out, fingers brushing his sleeve. "Marcus, if we don't move now, we won't have another chance." He nodded, the motion stiff and mechanical. Their plan was simple. Disable one of the main obelisks and send a signal through its network that could disrupt the synchronization between the Uvarii and the transformed. It was a desperate gamble, built on the shaky hypothesis that the obelisks acted as both beacons and control centers. The journey to the nearest obelisk was a gauntlet through streets once alive with chatter, now haunted by silence. The buildings around them, scorched and fractured, stood like hollow sentinels. The few humans they passed did not speak or look up. Their eyes glistened silver, reflecting only the light of the obelisk in the distance. Some of them wept silently, as if trapped in a prison of flesh they no longer controlled. A sudden tremor rolled beneath their feet, a reminder that the city itself was now alive with the energy of the Uvarii. Marcus steadied Leah as the ground vibrated, the pulse matching the one in his own chest, a cruel echo of fear and inevitability. They pushed forward, their ragged breaths the only sound until they reached the square, where the obelisk rose like a monolith, black and glistening, its surface alive with swirling patterns of silver light. Guards stood around it, once human, now grotesque extensions of the Uvarii's will. Their limbs were elongated, silver tendrils running beneath translucent skin that pulsed with each thrum of the obelisk. Their eyes, once capable of joy and love, were now empty wells of silver. Leah inhaled sharply. "It's now or never," she whispered. Marcus set the small, modified pulse emitter down, fingers trembling as he activated it. The device emitted a low, growing whine, almost lost beneath the hum of the obelisk. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The transformed guards didn't flinch, their eyes locked onto the horizon as if they were looking through the fabric of reality itself. Then, the pulse hit. The hum of the obelisk wavered, a discordant note breaking the seamless rhythm that had bound the world. The transformed jolted as if struck by lightning, their bodies spasming as their voices erupted into a chorus of shrieks that cut through the silence like a blade. Marcus and Leah covered their ears as the sound reverberated through the square, bouncing off the ruins and rattling their bones. It worked, at least, it had started to. The obelisk cracked, hairline fractures spidering across its surface. Silver light spilled out in jagged arcs, illuminating the square with a cold, unforgiving glare. But as the light burst outward, something unexpected happened. From the fractured obelisk, a voice emerged, not the collective, controlled tone of the Uvarii, but a voice ancient and raw, saturated with something deeper than language. We did not come to conquer. We came to consume, as we have for millennia. You were never meant to endure. You were always meant to feed the cycle. Leah's knees buckled, the voice pressing down on her like a weight. She looked at Marcus, whose face was pale, eyes wide with the realization of the unthinkable truth. The Uvarii were not conquerors driven by malice or desire for power. They were harvesters, their arrival preordained, a cog in a cosmic mechanism that devoured civilizations to fuel its own existence. The obelisk shattered and the pulse rippled out, reaching the other structures in the distance. For a moment, silence fell, deep and consuming. The transformed crumpled to the ground, their bodies limp, eyes dull and lifeless. Marcus and Leah exchanged a brief look of triumph that faltered as the ground beneath them quivered. From the sky, tendrils of light descended, vast and serpentine, connecting the now dead obelisks to the heavens. The earth groaned, a low, mournful sound as fissures opened and silver tendrils writhed from the soil, creeping toward the fallen and the living alike. The Uvarii had planned for resistance. The cycle accounted for it. Their response was not anger or retaliation. It was a calm, methodical completion of the harvest. Marcus grabbed Leah's arm, pulling her back as one of the tendrils snapped inches from her face, its surface shifting and alive. Panic exploded in her chest, but there was nowhere to run. The city around them pulsed, alive with a sentience that transcended time and space, an endless loop of creation and consumption. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, the words lost in the roar of the earth splitting open, revealing a chasm of molten silver that pulsed like a beating heart. The tendrils closed in, wrapping around them both, cold and final. Their vision blurred as they were lifted toward the sky, where the web of silver connected to a vessel so vast it defied comprehension, a shadow of eternity. As they were drawn into the light, Leah's last thought was not of victory or defeat, but a profound, numbing realization. Humanity had never truly understood what it meant to be part of the cosmos, and now they never would. The cycle continued, indifferent to hope or fear, relentless in its purpose. And as the last remnants of human consciousness dissolved into the Uvarii's endless web, the stars above shimmered, vast and uncaring, as if they had witnessed this scene 1,000 times before, and would 1,000 times more.